Hello my bookworms, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name is Sydney. In today's video, we will be chatting all about the second quarter of this year in terms of bookish stats. So hey, what's up? How are you? I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for being here and hanging out with me for a little bit. If you're anything like me, you love a good stats video. Seeing the graphs, comparing them throughout the year, seeing progress or regression. It's satisfying, no matter what the outcome is. I love a good stat video, as long as it's bookish. So let's get into it, shall we? In this video, as previously noted, we are doing this second quarter of the year, which will include April, May, and June. We will also be comparing these 3 months to the previous quarter of January, February, March. So the very first thing is, how many books have I read per month? It's actually very satisfying. I've read 9 books each month in the second quarter of the year, which kind of feels like I leveled out a little bit because over the course of the year, it's gone 10, 11, 5, and then 999. We love the consistency. Is July going well? We don't need to talk about it right now because we're not in that quarter during this video. And going right from number of books per month, let's go to number of pages per month, all right? If you remember in my last quarterly update, the pages read in the month of March is a little bit different in the graph than in my actual reading journal because in between March and April, I was reading the Faithful and the Fallen series and I had read half of one of the books in March and finished it in April. So in my reading journal, I counted those respective pages in each month, but in here, I counted the book for the month that I actually finished it in. So the pages are all accounted for, they're just maybe a little bit different on the month totals, if that makes sense. And because of that, in my reading journal, my number of pages read in April was 3,401 pages, but in the stats spreadsheet, I have 4,037, which again, all of the pages are accounted for. March and April was just a heavy, like large book fantasy time for me and it was phenomenal. Pages read in May were 3,200 and in June was 2,941. One thing that I thought was interesting when looking at all these charts were figuring out what I read each month in terms of authors, like whether they were new to me or whether I've read from them before. And in April, in my top 2 of reading months this year in terms of page count, 8 of those books were repeat authors and 1 of them was a new to me author. Whereas on the other months in May and June, it was heavily the opposite way. May was 7 of the 9 were new to me. And likewise in June, 6 of the 9 books were new to me and 3 were only repeat authors. And it's kind of been like that throughout the whole entire year. I've read a lot of new authors this year, which is a fun thing to know. I wish I did this for my previous reading year so I know how it would stack up, but I think it's really exciting that I'm trying out so many new authors. Almost 60% of the books that I've read this year, I have not read from that author prior, while I'm still giving authors that I know and love or giving a second chance to, mostly the former. I'm still reading and I have about 40% of that, which I feel like is a really good balance because I'm finding new authors that I love or at the very least trying a lot of new ones out, which is exciting. My reading year so far has been pretty solid. Here's the breakdown of my monthly ratings between April, May, and June. As you can see, April had the most 5-star reads with 3 of them, while also having 3 books in the 4 and 4.5 range. But it also had one of my lowest rated books of this quarter, which was a 1.5 star, which is generous. I guess it could be just a 1 star. But then looking over at May and June, I had a good amount of like middle of the road books for me, right? May had quite a few 3 stars and June had predominantly 4 and 4.5 stars, while each of these months only had 1 5-star, not to mention the 1 star that happened in June. But looking at the yearly ratings, we can obviously see that the star rating that I have given out most frequently this year has been a 4-star, which is great. My average rating for the entire year so far is a 3.9, which makes sense. I mean, look at the graph. I've had 18 4-star books this year, 6 4.5, which you can still kind of count in the 4-star if you really want to, and then 12 5-star books, which is great. Counting the 1 and 1.5 stars, that'd be 3. 1 2-star book, 1 2.5 star book, 6 3 stars, and 4 3.5 stars. I've said this quite a few times already this year, but my reading year so far in terms of enjoyment has been really pretty solid. Mostly because I have given myself the freedom to do whatever the heck I want. Now, let's look at the genre breakdown. This was alarming last quarter because I had found out that romance was my 2nd most read genre of the year, which has never happened. I feel like even though I've never done stats before this year, I know for a fact that romance has never been that high in my genre count. And it's still up there. Happy to say my most read genre is still fantasy at 26.4%. And for the sake of not confusing myself, I have put contemporary and literary fiction both under literary fiction. Okay, so like my general fiction books all equated to 20.8%. So we'll say 21%. And romance is the same exact percentage. So fiction and romance are tied for second place at about 21% of my reading this year, which feels like it makes more sense because I feel like I am mostly like a fantasy and fiction reader. Those are my two favorite genres. I think I'm solidifying that. I think I'm finding who I am. But I have to say, I also am sort of a romance girly now. I wouldn't consider myself a hard romance reader, but I love a good romance. You know what I'm saying? Coming in third is actually horror at 9.4%, which is exciting. I would say this makes sense. This tracks because I am finding that I love a good horror, like psychological thriller horror sort of thing. After horror is sci-fi. Underneath that is a tie between mystery and historical. And at the bottom is magical realism and thriller. Both share the same percentage as well. As the year has progressed, I feel like this chart is making a little bit more sense. My reading tastes, I feel like, are being represented a little bit more accurately, and I'm feeling good about how these pies and colors look. Now, out of all of the books that I've read in the second quarter, how have I acquired them? You might be asking. Kind of happy with how these numbers shook out. There's an equal number of me having just purchased the books because I wanted to read them relatively soon, and I did, and an equal number of me having had them on my TBR. Previously owned, just happened to pick them up this quarter. Then the third pie is gifted at 7.4%, and then the smallest pie is I got it on my Kindle. Normally I would count that for either Kindle Unlimited or an ARC, and in this case it was an ARC that I got from a publisher that I read via Kindle. In terms of comparing this to the yearly how I have acquired books, still makes sense. I feel like it makes sense. These are just my habits. This is how I am, and should I change? Maybe. But 47% of the books I've read this year so far, I have just purchased new or thrifted them, but I have purchased them, used my own money. Then 32% of the books that I've read so far this year, I've previously owned. They've been on my TBR and I finally picked them up. That deserves a pat on the back. Very close to this last quarter's number, but the number of books that I have read this year so far that have been gifted to me is 7.5. Oh, and Kindle is actually 9.4, so that's actually in third, which I'm happy about. I'm slowly starting to use my Kindle more and more, which is exciting. And then about 4% of them have been rentals from my library. The format of these books on how I have read them and consumed the content is not surprising to anyone. Almost 70% of the reads I have done audio and physical, whether it be sometimes I listen to the audio, sometimes I sit down and read, or it's a tandem read where I will sit down and also be listening to it at the same time. That is my favorite thing to do. But whether it's any of those three things, almost 70% of my reading has been within those types of reading. Then 17% has been purely audiobook. Almost 8% is ebook and audio. So the same thing as physical and audio, but instead of a physical book, it's a Kindle book. Almost 4% is just physical without an audiobook. And then 2% has been an ebook without an audiobook. It makes sense to me. Having an audiobook while physically reading a book is my favorite way of consuming stories. I just think it's so fun. It's relaxing and exciting. It's just, I love it. I love it. One of my goals this year was to read and finish more series. The first quarter of the year, I definitely did a pretty good job at this. I had 35% were series and 65% were standalones. Second quarter, 44% were series and 55 were standalones. But now the difference between the first quarter and the second quarter has been what type of series, which is interesting to me at least, because the first quarter I was heavily reading and completing more fantasy series. Whereas the second quarter I've been reading romance books that are considered series. Like Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez is technically part of a series because Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez is Part of Your World too. You know, like you don't have to read them in order, but they're technically a series within the same world and realm of characters. So the second quarter series have been mostly that type of series, whereas the first quarter was more like actual chronological series style books, if that makes sense. Whereas all in all, in the whole year so far, it's been 40% series and 60% standalones, which I feel like is a good mix. Not mad about that one. Now, with all this data, with all this riveting, exciting data, I do have 6 books that in this quarter have been my favorite. In no particular order, purely just how they are stacked in front of me. The one on top is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, a Shakespeare dark academia thriller. I love loved everything about it. The pretentiousness, the twists, the turns, the vibes, the atmosphere. It was great. Next, we have Black Cake by Charmaine Wilkerson. This is a like generational style story. Really digs deep into familial history, what we inherit, and who we choose to become because of those things. Written beautifully. Loved the story so much. Next is Wayward by Amelia Hart. This is also a multi-generational sort of witchy story, and I mean, there's a crow in the cover, there's a crow in my necklace, there's a crow in my arm. Like, this book gave me what I felt when I read The Once and Future Witches by Alex E. Harrow. This is a very similar book. Like, if you liked that, read this, because I loved it. I loved it a lot. Seems like I read this book so long ago, but within this quarter, I have read Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez, which has easily become one of my favorite romances ever. Small town, country boy, big city girl. They live very different lives, but obviously they fall in love. Things are messy, and it's so good. And then obviously you knew it was coming. I will never shut up about this series. The last two books are in the Faithful and the Fallen series, which is Ruin and Wrath. I just truly hope that I can write a book of this caliber one day. That's how I feel. This is what I strive for, except maybe a little bit more feminist and gay, but you know. This series truly has my heart, and I love it so, so much. Again, we'll never shut up about them. If you want to know my most disappointing or lowest rated books of this quarter, they're not very exciting, but it's Obsidian by Jennifer L. Armentrout, as well as Barbarian Alien by Ruby Dixon. Both of those I feel similarly about. Didn't love them, and it is what it is. There were quite a few books that I read in this quarter that I had higher hopes for, and they ended up being a little bit underwhelming. Those are like in the 3-star range, but I will save those for a different wrap up. But I think that that's all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for being here and hanging out with me for a little bit. If you have made it this far in the video and don't know what to say, leave the little guy with the glasses emoji down below in the comments. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. I always appreciate your support. And of course, be kind to one another and happy reading. Bye.